Hello, this is the first of a set of videos for WJEC Eduqas A-Level Religious Studies, and we're looking at Philosophy Theme 1. Today we're going to talk specifically about cosmological arguments. Now, what are arguments and proofs anyway? Well, an argument is simply a set of statements such that one of them, the conclusion, is supported or implied by the others, the premises. There are two types of arguments that we need to know about: inductive and deductive arguments. Inductive arguments are arguments where the conclusion is at most probably and very likely true, but not necessarily true 100%. Deductive arguments, on the other hand, are ones in which the conclusion follows of logical necessity from the premises. So these give philosophical proof, provided that the premises are true. We also have two types of proofs: a priori and a posteriori. A priori, if you can think about the word prior, which is contained within that phrase, means any knowledge or anything we know which is prior to experience. So we don't need to go out into the world and see things or hear things or get some sense data to know these things. So things like mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, or things that are logically and necessarily true, such as that a square is not a circle. We don't need experience to elicit or to give us this knowledge. That knowledge which we do need experience for, that is dependent on experience, is known as a posteriori. And a posteriori, think about the word posterior, means that we have it after experience. So a priori is before experience, prior to, and a posteriori is posterior to or after experience. So this is things like, the grass being green. We can only know that through experience. So that would be an example of a posteriori knowledge. Now, what's the link between them? Well, inductive arguments tend to use a posteriori proofs. So they'll make observations of the world around, and they will infer a sensible conclusion from them that, we haven't observed, but that is likely true. So this is effectively how science works. You'll take pieces of evidence of the natural world, which is therefore a posteriori, and then scientists will sort of construct them in a certain order and say, okay, well, this is likely going to be true as a result. And that's the scientific method, and it's an example of inductive arguments. In terms of cosmological arguments, which is what we're going to be looking at today, they use inductive reasoning. So they're not going to give us like a conclusion which is 100% certain that we can't avoid. But they're going to say, okay, well, this is the evidence that we have. This is the a posteriori sort of evidence of the natural world, and we can infer this conclusion is the most likely. We can infer from the world around us that the most likely conclusion as to where it comes from is God. And that's what cosmological arguments are all based around, that central premise. But there are different types of cosmological arguments, so we're going to get into that now. First of all, we're going to look at Aquinas' cosmological arguments. So in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican philosopher and a theologian, he wrote in his magnum opus known as the Summa Theologiae, his 5 ways to prove God's existence, or to demonstrate God's existence. Remember, I used the word prove there in a sort of apprehensive sense because they're not deductive arguments. So they're not meant to show, okay, 100% certain this is the case, but they're supposed to be clues that point us in the direction towards the existence of God. So a lot of the concepts in which Aquinas uses in these 5 ways are maybe different to what we're aware of nowadays, and they come mostly from Aristotle and his book Metaphysics. So Aquinas believed in harmonizing faith and reason. He believed that the two could go together. And so obviously we have reason. For Aquinas as a Christian, that would be what our minds can come to apart from God's revelation. We also have faith, and that is revealed to by God in terms of the Bible and the church and tradition, whereas reason can also play a role. And for Aquinas, demonstrating God's existence is not something that needs to be held on, or needs to be discovered, I should say, by faith, but that can be discovered by reason. So he thinks that even if you're not a Christian, even if you're not religious, you can come to the knowledge of God's existence by reason alone. So he comes up with 5 ways, as we've said. 3 of those ways are classified under the umbrella of cosmological arguments, and we're going to look at those three ways now. The first one being the prime mover. So effectively what this is talking about is that there is something at the beginning of all things which moves the rest of things, right? What does it mean by move here? Because we can think, okay, move means going from one place to another. Not quite. Move, or motion, as it's often referred to, is defined as the reduction of potentiality to actuality, as you can see in bold here, right? Okay, what's actuality and potentiality? Think of actuality as the way something actually is at the present moment. So I'm actually, right, the state of actuality is that I'm sitting in a chair right now. That's my state of actuality. Potentiality then is something that I or any object has the potential capacity to be or to do. So the actuality, or what I'm actually doing, is I'm sitting in a chair, but I have the potentiality to stand up. So another example could be a hot cup of coffee. If I have a hot cup of coffee, its actuality is that it's a hot cup of coffee, but it has the potentiality to be a cold cup of coffee. And when it becomes that cold cup of coffee, what's happened is it's moved, right? Not as in physically moved, it may well have done, it may not have, but it's been reduced from potentiality, so it could have been, the hot cup could have been cold, to actually becoming cold. So the actuality switches. So what we've got there is movement. Okay, so don't think of it strictly as like an object moving, like a car, going ahead. It just means something going from what it could be to actually being in that state of actuality. So only something, and this is what Aquinas says next, only something in actuality can actualize a potential. So everything that is in a state of actuality, right? It depends on what the thing is, but everything that exists is in some sort of state of actuality. And for a potential to be actualized, so for something that could be in a certain way to actually become that certain thing, or certain, manner, there needs to be something, some sort of cause that causes it to go from potentiality to actuality. And that thing that causes that jump has to be within actuality itself. So it has to be actually existing in a certain sense. So it follows from this that what is moved by another. Now, we can't have a sequence. What we're going to have is a sequence of moving things. So we're going to have one thing that moves, is being moved by another, and that's being moved, going from potentiality to actuality. But this sequence can't just go on forever. It can't go on, in the Latin phrase, ad infinitum, which means for infinity, right? To an infinite regress. Because if it were this way, then that would mean there was no starting point setting everything else in motion. So what we have to posit is that there is actually a starting point. There is something which sets everything else in motion. That something is referred to by Aquinas as the prime mover. So that original mover that causes everything else to move from a state of potentiality to actuality and sets off that chain, that is the prime mover. And for Aquinas, that is what we mean by God, right? The unmoved mover. So, I can move something. I can move my phone to here. That it can potentially go on the desk. Now it's actually on the desk when I put it on the desk. So I've moved that, but I am myself moved by other things. And other influences. You keep on going back, and you eventually arrive at God. And God is unmoved. He is not set in motion or reduced from potentiality to actuality by anything else. That also means that God is pure actuality. He has no potentiality within him. So he is the source of all actuality, he's the source of all potentiality, but he himself has no potentiality within him. He's only pure actuality or act. And that is just what we mean by God. So he uses here, again we can see some Aristotelian terms, and he sort of arrives at a prime mover and then equates that with God. And we're going to see later on that maybe some people will have an issue with saying that the prime mover is God necessarily, maybe it's something else. But that's the first way. Now on to the second way. This one can be confused with the first way. It's not too dissimilar. But there are some key differences. So this is known as the first cause argument. So basically what Aquinas uses is the principle of cause and effect. The first thing he observes is that effects have causes. You can't have an effect without a cause. Now, he then uses, again, Aristotelian terminology in terms of the four causes. So if you know anything about Aristotle, he posited there were four different causes. We have the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. For our purposes here, the only one that's relevant is the efficient cause. And basically what that is the third party that moves something from potentiality to actuality. So the efficient cause of, making a clay jar is the person who actually makes that clay jar. The final cause is like what it's set out to do. And then the material and the formula are to do with the actual clay jar itself. But the efficient cause is the one who actually is like outside of it and acts upon it to cause something to move from potentiality to actuality, right? So that cause, that efficient cause, Aquinas notices must precede the effect, right? You have a cause and then you have the effect. You can't have it the other way around. It has to be in that order. As an effect cannot cause itself. As we've established, every effect has to have a cause. So what we have then is we have a series, a hierarchical series to be precise, of cause and effect, and it keeps on going back, right? Similar to how we had it with movers in the last argument, right? Again, Aquinas says that this is impossible for this chain of cause and effect to go on to infinity ad infinitum, because if it was so, that would mean there would be no first cause, and if there's no first cause, then we have no intermediate cause and no ultimate cause, and so basically we'd have any effect, right? Remember we said earlier that without a cause you can't have an effect, but we know that there are effects. We know that things are, and so therefore it follows that there has to be a first cause. And again, Aquinas calls this God. So the first cause then, what characteristics would that first cause have? Well, if it's the setting off the chain, it has to be uncaused, right? So everything else is caused after that first cause, but itself just has to be self-caused. It can't be caused by something else, because again, you can't go into infinity, right? So if it's uncaused, that means it's eternal. It's always existed. It didn't come into being at one point, so it's always been there. And it's also the ground of everything else in existence. It causes everything to be. And this is precisely what we mean by God for Aquinas. Perhaps an analogy might help. Think of a train, and we have the locomotive and the different boxes of the train, the different carriages, right? So the locomotive is the cause of the movement of all the other carriages. So you have the locomotive, which is pure movement, right? It's just moving. It's the cause of the movement of everything else, and it sort of sets off that chain. So think of the locomotive as being God, and each carriage being the series of effects that follow from that and cause and effect. Okay, so that's the second argument. Then we move on to the third argument, which is known as the argument for a necessary being. So we've got another distinction here. We've got to distinguish between contingent beings and necessary beings. Contingent beings are beings that may exist, but do not have to exist. So they're dependent on something else for their existence. So I'm contingent. The computer in front of me is contingent. Everything that I can see, that I can experience, is contingent. It may not be. Necessary beings, on the other hand, if there are any, are beings which have to exist of necessity. They cannot not exist, in other words. So they do not require another to exist, and they're not dependent or contingent on other beings for their existence. They just exist. They have to. So Aquinas thinks, well, hang on a minute. Imagine if everything was contingent. Imagine if everything could not be. Well, that would mean that at one point there would be nothing, because everything doesn't exist in necessity, so at one point there would be nothing. And if at one point there would be nothing, then even now there would be nothing. Because as we know, out of nothing, nothing comes. But this is absurd. There is not nothing, there is something. What does that imply? Well, it implies that there hasn't always been contingent things. There hasn't always been this idea of like everything just being possible. So he infers from this that there has to be something which exists of necessity. Because if everything was contingent, then there would be nothing. Because nothing could come out of nothing, if that sort of makes sense. So what we have to posit then is a necessary being. Remember that the distinction between contingent and necessary beings doesn't necessarily mean there is a necessary being, that's just what they mean. But Aquinas argues that it's impossible for there to be only contingent things. There has to be at least one necessary being. And that necessary being for Aquinas is God. Again, maybe some people find an issue with that leap, saying, okay, the necessary being is God. But Aquinas thinks that while this necessary being exists of necessity, therefore it's eternal, it's always existed, it's the ground of everything else in existence, and that is what we mean by God, right? Someone could say, well, what about if there were several necessary beings? Why is there only one? Why is there only one God? And I believe it's Richard Swinburne who argues that it's a lot simpler to posit only one necessary being than many. And there could also be some arguments that say, actually, there can only be one necessary being because, you know, it's sort of like the incoherence of polytheism, where you have like multiple all-powerful gods. Well, how can you have multiple all-powerful gods if they're all powerful, right? Wouldn't there be something distinguishing them? And if there isn't, then there's just one God. So for some people, it's the simplest explanation is that there's only one necessary being, and there is only one God, therefore. Okay, that's Aquinas. Let's move on to a more modern version of the cosmological argument by looking at a person called William Lane Craig. So in 1979, he wrote a book about the Kalam cosmological argument. Effectively, the argument goes as follows. Premise 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. And we're going to see, similar to the second way of Aquinas, that cause, according to Craig, is God. Now, how does Craig justify the first premise, that everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence? Well, according to Craig, this is just self-evident. We just know it, right? This is very basic sort of understanding here. That, you know, we don't just observe things popping into existence out of nothing. There has to be something which causes something to exist, right? There aren't just things arising out of nothing. What about the second premise? Because this one is a bit more controversial. The universe began to exist. To do this, he has to prove that the universe is not infinite, that it had a moment in time in which it began. And this is the argument that Craig gives to support that premise. Number 1, an actual infinite cannot exist. Number 2, a beginningless temporal series of events is an actual infinite. Conclusion, therefore, a beginningless temporal series of events cannot exist. In other words, the universe cannot have always existed, it has to have come into being at one point. So, again, there's another distinction that we have to look at, which is the distinction between actual infinites and potential infinites. So an actual infinite is a set that contains an infinite number of members with no beginning and no end. Whereas a potential infinite is not actually an infinite in the strict sense of the word, but it's a set that gets closer and closer to infinity, but never actually reaches it. So he thinks that actual infinites can't exist. We never can actually have a set of really infinite things. And he thinks this because if it were so, there would be many contradictions. So he gives the example of a bookshelf with an infinite number of books. On the bookshelf, there is also an infinite number of red books and an infinite number of black books. From this it follows that there are as many red books as the collection of all the books, meaning there are as many red books as there are red and black books combined. This seems absurd, and so it seems to follow from this that we can't have an actual infinite. So, if actual infinites are not possible, time must be finite. Because if it were not, we wouldn't have actually reached the present moment, right? If time were infinite, there wouldn't be a present. So it follows from this, according to Craig, that the universe began to exist. It's not eternal. That's the philosophical argument for the non-eternality of the universe. But you can also defend that premise according to science. A commonly accepted theory, in fact the pretty much established theory of the beginning of the universe, is the Big Bang Theory, which states that the universe began from a singularity which exploded 13.7 billion years ago. And before this theory was proposed by the Belgian Catholic priest Father Georges Lemaitre in the 20th century, it was believed by many, especially atheists, and atheist scientists that the universe was actually eternal. But this scientific theory used, which is backed up by evidence of things like redshift, seems to suggest that actually the universe came into being at one point. It hasn't always been there. So, in that way, he tries to demonstrate that the first and the second premises are true. Now, if we just think back to that argument, it was written in a form whereby the conclusion follows of logical necessity. So if the first premise is true, which Craig thinks is self-evident, and the second premise can be defended both philosophically and scientifically, then the conclusion that the universe had to have a cause of its existence follows of logical necessity. So what he's done then, according to Craig, is he's established a need for the cause of the universe. But what is this cause and why is it God? Effectively what Craig does is he analyses the qualities of what this cause must be like. And he says this. Number one, the cause is uncaused, as it's the cause of everything in existence. Number two, it follows that this is eternal and self-existent with no beginning or no end. And also, because this cause caused the universe to exist, it has to be immensely powerful to have created everything in existence. Now, this is a bit more controversial, number four, but he says that the cause is personal, because the only way to have a temporal effect, that is the universe, right, because the universe came into being at a certain time, from an eternal cause, that is God, is that cause freely chose to create. So you have an eternal cause, which is always existing, doesn't have a beginning or end, but then at one point, the universe begins to exist. How can we explain this, other than if that cause was an unembodied personal mind which chooses to create? So he says that this cause is personal. So these qualities of being uncaused, eternal, powerful, personal, align for many with the traditional characteristics of God. And so Craig deduces, okay, well, this cause then of the universe is God. Who else could it be? Now, we're going to look now at the strengths of cosmological arguments. Number one, it's a posteriori. Remember we talked about earlier the idea that a posteriori uses evidence. It uses evidence of the world that our senses can discover, and that's referred to as empirical evidence. So we can all use our eyes, our ears, well, if we have them, properly functioning, and we can come to this data that, okay, I can look out and I can see a universe exists. It also uses the scientific principle of cause and effect. Scientists use this principle a lot, right? If they see something happening, for example, a chemical reaction, they're going to say, okay, what caused this? And we know that Aquinas' second way, for example, uses that principle. Number two, the arguments are logical and simple. They're easy to follow. They're not, some sort of really complex, deep sort of, modal logic or whatever. It's quite simple, and a lot of people can follow it. And it does give a simple explanation as to why there's something rather than nothing. For many, it's a better explanation than just, this links with number three as well, just the idea that, it just came into being out of nothing, or that it's always been there. For many, the idea that there's a cause, God behind this all, makes more sense. Also, if you think about it in terms of scientifically, we don't have any scientific explanation as to why the universe exists, right? Some would argue there isn't a why, it just is. It's a brute fact, as Bertrand Russell says. But really, there isn't any physical explanation as to why the universe had to exist or why it is in existence, even if the Big Bang is true, which many theists do accept, right? But maybe that isn't enough. What caused the Big Bang? Someone may ask. This links on with number four as well, right? Leibniz, who was a German philosopher, he was a rationalist, said that the principle of sufficient reason, which is the idea that basically everything has a reason for its existence or as to why it does something, provides a reason for the universe. How can there be a contingent universe without an explanation? And for Leibniz and those proponents of the cosmological argument, the hypothesis of God explains this fact best. And finally, and this is specifically a strength of Craig's argument, is that the cosmological argument shows that the cause of the universe is personal. And this is better because if we remember, we talked about the first three ways of Aquinas, and how many think that he made a jump between, the prime mover, the first cause, and then saying, okay, that's God. For many, they think, why does it have to be God? Why couldn't it be something else? But Craig shows that the cause of the universe, is personal, because obviously he says that a temporal effect can only arise from a eternal cause if that eternal cause has a mind and an ability to choose a will. So this is important because up until then it was believed that cosmological arguments didn't really show that the cause had to be personal, and that is one of the key characteristics of the God of classical theism. So those are some strengths there, and you don't have to agree with them. There are many points there that people would disagree with and think are actually wrong, and there are actually some weaknesses perhaps, but those are some things that people could argue in favour of the cosmological arguments. So the example he gives of the fallacy of composition is this: since every man has a mother, therefore the whole human race has a mother. That's absurd, right? So just because there are causes and effects perhaps within the universe doesn't mean that the universe itself has a cause. That's the fallacy of composition for some. Number 3, inductive leap. Since Hume was an empiricist, he believed that sense experience provided us with knowledge. But since we have no sense experience of the beginning of the universe, no one observed it, no one was there, we cannot assume to know for sure exactly what happened. That would be to make an inductive leap. That is to say, inductive, we have this empirical evidence of what we can know, and here's what we can't know. And to make that jump is unwarranted. We can't go from this point to that without any empirical evidence. We have no empirical evidence of the beginning of the universe, and therefore we just don't know. Number 4, perhaps God isn't the explanation, and science instead provides the answer. Now remember how we said that many don't like the fact that Aquinas, and maybe even Craig, just say that the first cause, or the prime mover, the necessary being, has to be God. Why does it have to be God? Couldn't it be many gods? Couldn't it be an impersonal God, despite what Craig claims? Or maybe it's a God that Aquinas and Craig don't believe in. Aquinas and Craig are Christians. They believe specifically in the Trinity. They believe in the God of classical theism. But what if it is not their God? Some, though, would argue this doesn't really object to the cosmological argument, because the cosmological argument could be used for any God, perhaps even many. So it doesn't necessarily prove the Christian God's existence, fair enough. But that doesn't mean that the cosmological argument is flawed. It just means that it can refer to any God or to a different God. Stephen Hawking, who is a famous scientist, has also argued that the Big Bang provides the explanation for the universe's existence. So we don't need to assert that God is behind it all. So the singularity that exploded is the reason that there is a universe. We don't need to, introduce God into the picture. But some would argue, actually, what caused the Big Bang? What came before that, right? The Big Bang can't just happen out of nothing. There has to be something before that. And for many theists, the answer is God. We also have an objection from Anthony Kenny, who said that Newton's laws of motion wrecked Aquinas' first way. Because remember what we said, objects cannot move from potentiality to actuality by themselves. They have to be moved from something already in actuality. But according to Kenny, Newton demonstrates that actually objects can move by themselves. And finally, according to some arguments, inductive or deductive cannot prove that God exists. So, for example, Kant says that God is beyond the world of sense experience. And since he is beyond the world of sense experience and reason, we cannot demonstrate that he exists using either of those tools. Also, remember that we said the argument claims to be a posteriori, meaning it uses evidence that is empirical and that is from the real world. He, similarly to the inductive leap, he thinks that actually it makes a jump from experience to guesswork, because maybe the fact that things within the universe are being caused or that the universe exists, that is a posteriori, but then the conclusion is not a posteriori. The conclusion is just guesswork. The universe itself being caused, and God. And that, for him, isn't truly a posteriori, because it's not experiential. It's something beyond that. And finally, he also questioned how God, who exists outside of time, can act on the universe, can actually create. The eternal cause can have a temporal effect. Because isn't God supposed to be timeless? How can he cause something to be in time? And so those are some of the various criticisms that can be levelled against the cosmological arguments. And it's important to weigh up the strengths and the weaknesses and to see what you think is more persuasive. But that's all for the cosmological argument.